To curb infections, Vietnam has been implementing a dengue early warning system in several provinces for the past 2 years. That is considered an effective tool for the health sector to prevent the transmission of dengue in the community.
Families in Nha Trang, Vietnam, are standing in their living rooms, opening glass jars, and intentionally releasing swarms of mosquitoes into their homes. It looks like a collective psychological breakdown, but it's actually a brilliant, high-tech gamble. For a century, we tried to kill them with poison and failed. Now, according to the World Mosquito Program, Vietnam is manufacturing billions of better mosquitoes to reprogram nature from the inside out. But wait, why would anyone welcome the very thing killing us? The poverty trap. To understand why anyone would willingly invite a swarm of mosquitoes into their living room, you have to understand the specific type of terror that the rainy season used to bring to Vietnam. For decades, the arrival of the monsoons wasn't just a change in the weather, it was the start of a predictable, high-stakes gamble with human life. We're talking about dengue fever, a disease so brutal it's commonly known as breakbone fever, because it literally feels like your skeleton is snapping from the inside out. In places like Nha Trang, the sound of the first heavy rain was essentially the starting gun for a national emergency that never seemed to end. According to the World Health Organization, dengue has seen a 30-fold increase in global incidence over the last 50 years. In Vietnam, this wasn't just a health crisis. It was a massive, hidden drain on the country's soul and its wallet. Here's the thing about dengue that people in the global north rarely have to consider. It acts like a poverty tax. When an outbreak hits, it doesn't just put one person in the hospital. It pulls a parent away from their job to sit by a bedside. It drains a family's life savings for medical bills, and it traps entire communities in a cycle of debt. If you didn't grow up in a tropical zone, it's hard to imagine. But for those who did, the rainy season was often synonymous with hospital season. It was a reality that London or New York simply didn't have to care about because it wasn't happening on their doorstep. Think about how much a single fever actually costs a nation's GDP when it's happening to millions of people simultaneously every single year. The status quo for dealing with this was, quite frankly, a total disaster. We relied on fogging, those massive trucks that drive through neighborhoods, pumping out clouds of chemical pesticides. But wait, because here's where it gets frustrating. Those chemicals were basically a bandage on a bullet wound. They would kill the adult mosquitoes for a day or two, but the larvae in the water remained untouched, and the survivors eventually developed an immunity to the poison. We were essentially training the mosquitoes to be tougher while we poisoned our own streets. According to researchers at the Wolbachia project in Vietnam, they realized that we were stuck in a loop of failure. The traditional way of killing the enemy was a losing game, because nature is better at breeding than we are at murdering. We were pouring money and chemicals into a void and getting nothing back but more debt and more death. It was entirely clear that we didn't need a bigger hammer. We needed a software patch for the ecosystem itself. We needed to stop trying to wipe out the mosquito and start thinking about how to turn it into a Trojan horse. How do you even begin to convince a population that has spent generations fearing a mosquito that the solution is to breed billions more of them? It sounds like a joke, or worse, a conspiracy. But when you've watched your children suffer through the same fever every year, despite the clouds of pesticides, you start to become open to radical ideas. You start to realize that the old way was never going to save us. The transition from the poison era to the genetic era represents the biggest pivot in the history of public health. And it all comes down to a tiny, naturally occurring bacterium that scientists found hiding in a fruit fly. This bacteria was about to do what a century of chemicals couldn't, but to make it work, they had to convince thousands of ordinary people to become the primary distributors of the world's most hated insect. And that's exactly where the story moves from the lab and into those glass jars we saw earlier. Because the secret wasn't just in the science, it was in the way the mosquito's own biology was about to be turned against the virus it carries. The biological patch. The real breakthrough didn't come from a new chemical formula or a better bug spray, but from a tiny, naturally occurring bacterium called Wolbachia. Here is the thing about Wolbachia. It is already one of the most common bacteria on the planet. It exists in about 60% of all insect species, from fruit flies to butterflies, where it just hangs out inside their cells as a harmless passenger. But for some reason, the specific mosquito that causes us the most trouble, the Aedes aegypti, was one of the few insects on Earth that didn't have it. Scientists realized that if they could just find a way to get Wolbachia into that mosquito, they might be able to break the virus from the inside. Now, here is where it gets interesting. When Wolbachia lives inside a mosquito, it acts like a high-tech security system. It competes with viruses like dengue, Zika, and yellow fever for the same resources inside the mosquito's body. It essentially starves the virus out. Because Wolbachia is taking up all the energy and physical space, the virus can't replicate. So, even if the mosquito bites someone with dengue, the virus gets stuck in the mosquito's gut and never makes it to the salivary glands. The mosquito is still there, it's still biting, but it has been rendered entirely incapable of spreading the disease. It is a biological hack in the truest sense of the word. We didn't actually change the mosquito's DNA, we just gave it a new roommate that absolutely hates viruses. But wait, because getting that roommate to move in was one of the most tedious and fragile scientific feats in history. According to a report in Nature, the early days of this project were spent in labs where researchers had to manually micro-inject Wolbachia into mosquito eggs. Think about that for a second. A mosquito egg is smaller than a grain of salt, and you are trying to use a microscopic needle to inject a living bacterium into it without killing the embryo. It was a process so delicate that if your hand shook even a fraction of a millimeter, the whole batch was ruined. It took years of failure before they finally got a single female mosquito to survive with Wolbachia and, more importantly, pass it on to her offspring. And get this, the bacteria have a built-in reproductive hack that makes it almost impossible to stop once it's in the wild. It's a mechanism called cytoplasmic incompatibility. It sounds complicated, but it's essentially a biological lock-and-key system. If a male mosquito with Wolbachia mates with a normal female, the eggs won't hatch at all. They're just duds. However, if a female with Wolbachia mates with any male, whether he has the bacteria or not, her eggs will hatch, and every single one of those babies will carry Wolbachia. This creates a massive evolutionary advantage. The Wolbachia-carrying mosquitoes don't just survive, they systematically replace the native population. According to researchers at Monash University, who have been pioneers in the World Mosquito Program, this was the software patch the world had been waiting for. You aren't trying to fight an uphill battle against nature anymore. You are using nature's own reproductive drive to spread the cure. The early lab struggles proved that the science worked on a small scale, but they were still just looking at a few thousand mosquitoes in cages. To save a city like Nha Trang, let alone the entire country of Vietnam, they couldn't rely on scientists with microscopes and needles anymore. They needed to move from the lab to the factory. A few lab-grown mosquitoes couldn't save a country. They needed an industrial-scale invasion, and that meant they had to figure out how to turn a blood-sucking pest into a mass-produced product that the public would actually want to buy into. The billion-creature factory. Once the lab science was proven, the challenge shifted from biology to pure, cold logistics. It's one thing to have a few thousand mosquitoes in a sterile room, but it's another thing entirely to manufacture them by the billions. To pull this off, Vietnam had to build what are essentially the first insect factories in places like Nha Trang and Vinh. When you step inside these rearing facilities, you aren't looking at a traditional laboratory anymore. It feels much more like a high-precision semiconductor plant, only instead of silicon wafers, the assembly line is producing millions of living, breathing, blood-sucking organisms every single week. Here is the thing about a factory that produces life. It has a very specific and very visceral fuel requirement. To keep a population of 10 million insects healthy and breeding every day, you need blood, tons of it. According to the World Mosquito Program, which oversees these rearing facilities, the mosquitoes are fed human-grade blood, the same kind you'd find in a hospital's blood bank. It is a strange, slightly uncomfortable reality to wrap your head around. You have these massive climate-controlled rooms filled with racks of cages, and every single one of those insects is essentially being powered by the lifeblood of the very species it has spent centuries terrorizing. It is the first time in history we have treated biology like a mass-production industrial process, where the product is a biological Trojan horse. Think about the sheer scale of the engineering required here for a second. You aren't just breeding them, you have to sort them. In a normal ecosystem, the males don't bite. Only the females do, because they need the protein from blood to produce eggs. But for this specific software patch to spread, you need both. Now, imagine trying to separate millions of tiny, flying insects by gender. You can't exactly do it by hand. Instead, the engineers developed what they call the sorting machine. It's an incredibly clever piece of tech that uses air pressure and precise physical filters to separate the larvae. Because the male pupae are slightly smaller than the females, the machine uses a gentle vacuum to pull the males through a specific mesh, while leaving the females behind. It's a level of industrial precision that you'd expect in a factory making microchips, not mosquitoes. According to reports from the Bao Chin Phu, the official news organ of the Vietnamese government, this factory model is the only reason the project didn't stall out. To actually flip the switch on an entire city's ecosystem, you have to achieve a critical mass of Wolbachia. You have to release infected mosquitoes enough so that they outnumber the native ones. If you don't hit that number, the natural population will just drown out your patch. This meant the facility in Nha Trang had to reach a point where it was outputting a steady, relentless stream of insects. Millions every single week, month after month. It is a logistical marathon where the fuel is blood and the output is a microscopic bacterium. And get this, the facility isn't just a breeding ground, it's a high-security vault. They have to ensure that no wild mosquitoes get in and no unfixed mosquitoes get out prematurely. The technicians move through airlocks, wearing specialized suits, managing a life cycle that has been accelerated to its absolute physical limit. They've optimized everything, from the temperature of the water to the specific humidity levels that trigger the most efficient egg laying. It is a masterpiece of modern engineering, but it's also a deeply weird one. You're looking at a room that contains more individual lives than most cities, all of them being prepared for a one-way trip into the community. Every legend has a hero, but in this case, the hero isn't just the scientist with the microscope or the engineer with the sorting machine. Who do you think actually does the heavy lifting in a project like this? It isn't the government, it's the neighbors. Because here's where it gets interesting. You can have the most advanced insect factory on the planet, and you can sort them with all the air pressure in the world, but you can't just drop a billion mosquitoes from a plane and hope for the best. You need the people who live in those neighborhoods to actually want those insects there. You need them to open their doors and let the factory's product inside. This industrial-scale invasion only works if the enemy is welcomed with open arms. And that transition, from the factory floor to the kitchen table, required a psychological shift that was even more difficult to engineer than the mosquitoes themselves. The mosquito mothers. You can have the most advanced lab in the world and a factory capable of pumping out millions of insects a week, but you still have to deal with the fact that nobody actually wants a mosquito in their house. This was the massive social hurdle that the project faced in Nha Trang. You're essentially asking people to stop swatting the very thing that has been terrorizing their families for generations. In almost any other country, a plan to release billions of factory-grown insects would have been met with immediate, loud conspiracy theories about government surveillance or biological warfare. But in Vietnam, the success of this entire operation didn't come from a top-down order. It came from a cultural superpower called collective duty. Here is where it gets truly fascinating. To solve the distribution problem, the project organizers didn't hire a massive fleet of delivery trucks. Instead, they reached out to the Vietnam Women's Union, which is this incredibly powerful and deeply rooted social network that reaches into almost every single household in the country. They recruited what would eventually be known as the mosquito mothers. These were local women who were given what the project calls egg release kits. Imagine a simple plastic container, a few mosquito eggs already infected with Wolbachia, and some fish food. The instructions were surprisingly domestic. Just add water, keep it in your kitchen or on your porch, and wait for the product to hatch and fly away. It turned a highly complex scientific experiment into a simple community chore, right next to watering the plants or feeding the chickens. According to reports from Vietnam News, this scaling up wasn't just about the numbers, it was about trust. When your neighbor, someone you've known for 20 years, tells you that these mosquitoes are actually the good ones that will protect your kids from dengue, you listen. You don't see a scientist in a lab coat. You see a mother who cares about the street just as much as you do. These women organized what were essentially release ceremonies, where groups of neighbors would gather to open their jars simultaneously, turning a biological invasion into a neighborhood celebration. Now, here is where the human element really shines. These women were so dedicated that they'd often track the progress of their kits with the same pride a gardener has for a prized orchid. They weren't just following orders, they were participating in a national defense strategy. Think about that for a second. In a world where we can barely agree on basic facts, thousands of families in Vietnam were willingly turning their own homes into mini nurseries for the world's most hated insect. And get this, they did it with a level of precision that a government agency could never match. They knew exactly where the standing water was. They knew which houses had the most shade, and they ensured that the patch was applied to every square inch of the city. According to the files of the World Mosquito Program, the results of this community-led distribution were almost immediate. Because the mosquito mothers were so thorough, the Wolbachia-carrying mosquitoes didn't just survive, they completely overran the local population in record time. It is a stunning example of how Vietnam's success wasn't just a technical achievement, it was a cultural one. They took a terrifying, invisible threat and made the solution a matter of household pride. But even with all that community support, the scientists still needed hard, cold proof that their biological Trojan horse was actually stopping the disease. The mothers did their job, and then came the data that finally silenced the skeptics and proved that the software patch wasn't just working in theory, it was literally rewriting the health statistics of an entire nation. The data of defiance. The results that started trickling out of Nha Trang and the surrounding districts weren't just a win for the local health departments. They were a complete middle finger to a century of failed chemical warfare. When you look at the 2021 and 2022 study periods, the numbers are almost hard to believe until you realize they've been replicated across the globe. We're talking about a 77% drop in dengue incidence. Think about that for a second. We didn't invent a new vaccine that requires a cold chain supply line or a pill that costs a week's wages. We just changed the internal software of a bug. According to the landmark trials published in the New England Journal of Medicine, specifically the Yogyakarta comparison from Indonesia that served as the gold standard for the Vietnam rollout, this wasn't a fluke. It was a systematic dismantling of a virus's ability to move. In those trials, not only did the fever cases drop by 77%, but hospitalizations for severe dengue plummeted by a staggering 86%. Vietnam saw those same lines on the graph start to flatline. We finally had the scientific truth we needed. You can effectively delete a disease from a region without having to commit ecological genocide against the species that carries it. But here is the thing that should honestly make you a little cynical. If we have a biological tool that can slash a global health crisis by nearly 80% without using a single drop of poison, why isn't this the lead story on every news cycle? Why isn't every tropical nation on Earth screaming for these egg kits? Well, there's an uncomfortable truth buried in the economics of a solution that replicates itself for free. According to reports in Nature, the beauty of Wolbachia is that it's self-sustaining. Once the mosquito mothers release that first generation and they mate, the bacteria do the rest of the work. It doesn't need a patent renewal. It doesn't need a monthly subscription or a high-priced distribution network. Big Pharma and the massive chemical conglomerates don't exactly make a killing from a one-time biological patch that stays in the environment forever. We've spent decades pouring billions into a revolving door of pesticides and treatments that treat the symptoms but never the cause. Now that we have a way to actually break the cycle, the silence from the traditional medical industry is almost deafening. This is a technology that belongs to the people of Vietnam and the scientists at Monash University, not a boardroom in Basel or New York. It is a masterpiece of open-source biology. And get this, the bacteria are so incredibly resilient that once it hits a critical mass in a neighborhood, it stays there. The researchers found that years after the initial release, the mosquitoes in Nha Trang were still nearly 100% fixed with Wolbachia. The patch didn't wear off. It didn't require a booster shot. It just became a permanent part of the local ecosystem, a microscopic shield that guards every crib and every porch in the city. It's a level of public health efficiency that feels almost illegal in a world driven by profit margins. But as these better mosquitoes continue to breed and expand their territory, they're doing something the scientists didn't necessarily plan for. They're moving. They don't recognize the lines we draw on maps, and they don't care about local jurisdictions. As the better mosquitoes move across the border into neighboring territories, they're starting to create a new kind of political tension. We've proven the science works, but now we're entering a world where one country's cure might be another country's unauthorized biological release. The data of defiance proved the science, but the real-world borders are about to prove much harder to navigate. The genetic border. The moment those billions of mosquitoes took flight from the kitchens of Nha Trang, they did something that no diplomat or border guard could ever stop. They ignored every map we've ever drawn. Here is the thing about a biological solution that replicates itself. It doesn't recognize a passport. When Vietnam decided to upgrade its mosquito population with Wolbachia, they weren't just making a decision for their own citizens. They were unilaterally deciding the biological future of an entire region. If those mosquitoes fly across the border into Cambodia or Laos, the patch goes with them. We are looking at a brand new concept in geopolitics that we can call biological sovereignty, and frankly, we are not prepared for it. According to a study from the U.S. Geological Survey regarding the spread of invasive species, we know that these insects are master hitchhikers. They don't just fly, they move in the wheel wells of trucks, the holds of cargo ships, and the luggage of travelers. This means that Vietnam's local health project is effectively a regional takeover. But wait, because here is the uncomfortable truth that keeps international lawyers up at night. Right now, there are almost zero international regulations that govern what a country can do with its own air and its own biology if those choices have permanent, cross-border consequences. If one country decides to release a self-sustaining biological agent, they're essentially forcing their neighbors to participate in the experiment, whether they want to or not. Think about the sheer weight of that for a second. We've been having this massive global debate about extinction versus upgrade, whether we should use gene drives to wipe a species out or just use bacteria like Wolbachia to fix them. But while the philosophers in Europe and America are arguing about ethics, Vietnam is already doing it. They've moved past the what-if stage and into the what-now stage. It's a fascinating, slightly chaotic shift in how we think about the world. For the first time in history, a single nation has the power to permanently rewrite the ecosystem of a continent without ever firing a shot or passing a single treaty. Now, here's where it gets even weirder. According to the files at the Wolbachia project in Vietnam, they are seeing that this biological shield is remarkably stable, but it's moving into territories that have entirely different political and environmental standards. We're witnessing a world where biology is becoming a form of soft power. If Vietnam can prove its population is dengue-free while its neighbors are still struggling, the economic and social pressure to follow suit becomes overwhelming. It's an upgrade that spreads like a virus, forcing everyone in its path to adapt to a new reality. But here is the thing that truly haunts the halls of global ethics. We are essentially playing God with a species we don't fully understand. While the success in Vietnam is undeniable, it raises a chilling question about consent. When a government releases billions of modified organisms, they aren't just treating a patient. They are altering the biological heritage of every living soul in that zip code without a signature or a waiver. According to the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, we are entering an era where environmental intervention might become mandatory for survival. Think about that for a second. We are trading a natural plague for a man-made equilibrium. It's a brilliant trade-off today, but we have to wonder what happens in 50 years if the patch glitches. We've spent centuries trying to conquer nature, but Vietnam is showing us that the real power lies in subtly rewriting it. The map of Southeast Asia is literally being redrawn at a microscopic level. But there is one final piece of the puzzle that no one really expected to matter this much. It involves the one thing no scientist or mother can control: the weather. The map is changing, but there is a looming factor that could either accelerate this biological revolution or turn it into a catastrophic mistake. And it all comes down to how the planet itself is shifting. Here is the thing about our changing planet. Mosquitoes are the ultimate opportunists. As global temperatures rise, the habitable zone for the Aedes aegypti is expanding at a terrifying rate. We aren't just talking about the tropics anymore. Areas that used to be too cold for these insects, think Southern Europe, the United Kingdom, and high-altitude cities in South America, are suddenly becoming prime real estate for dengue. According to a study from the Journal of Medical Entomology, mosquitoes are moving into new territories at a rate of several kilometers every year. But wait, this is where Vietnam's billions of creatures become a global insurance policy. If the old mosquitoes move north, they bring the virus with them. But if we can ensure the upgraded Wolbachia mosquitoes get there first, we essentially preemptively disarm the threat. It is a race against time. We are literally trying to outrun climate change with a biological patch. It's no longer just Vietnam's story. It's a preview of how the rest of the world will have to defend itself in a warming century. Now think about that for a second. We spent the last 100 years trying to build a wall between ourselves and nature using chemicals and concrete. We failed. Vietnam's better mosquito proves that the only way forward is to stop fighting the ecosystem and start participating in it. It's a radical shift from exterminate to collaborate. But get this, this isn't a silver bullet. Nature always finds a way to pivot. According to researchers at the Institute of Tropical Medicine, there's always a risk that the virus could evolve to bypass Wolbachia, or that the bacteria themselves could change over generations. It's a perpetual chess match. For now, the people of Nha Trang are winning, but this is a living, breathing experiment that never truly ends. So, next time you hear that familiar high-pitched buzz in your ear, ask yourself, is that the enemy? Or is it a factory-tuned ally carrying the software update that saves your life? We've turned the world's most hated insect into a high-tech delivery system. And honestly, it might be the only thing standing between us and the next global pandemic. Vietnam took the gamble. And so far, the house is winning.